In the twilight edges of the galaxy, where dying stars cast long shadows over drifting debris, a signal pulsed, a low, ancient frequency encoded in a language most had forgotten. It was not a call for help, not in the traditional sense. It was a resignation, a final breath folded into radiation. The last of the Draconids, Vaeraxis, waited to die alone. The galaxy had moved on from beings like him. Once revered as cosmic titans, the Draconids were declared threats by the Galactic Concord, deemed too uncontrollable, too powerful, too proud. What was once myth and majesty became an outlawed remnant. After centuries of strategic eradication, Vaeraxis was the last. His wings, capable of distorting magnetospheres, had been torn by Concord ray of fire. His body, once sheathed in living crystal, now fractured and leaking bioplasmic light into vacuum. No rescue fleet was coming. No morning songs would be sung. Civilizations across the galaxy received the signal. They knew its origin, recognized the cadence, and unanimously ignored it. Vaeraxis had outlived his time. His death would be a final convenience. The Concord labeled any attempt to aid him as illegal interference in galactic security. Former allies, once protectors of the Draconid kind, turned their backs in silence. He lay atop a barren asteroid, forgotten, a monument to pride and extinction. But the signal traveled farther than intended, reaching less patrolled space, where human ships still ran long-range scavenging operations. The Argonaut's Wake, a deep-range salvage freighter from Earth's Pacific Reach, intercepted the dying broadcast. Its crew didn't fully decode the message, nor grasp the weight behind the name, Vaeraxis. But they understood enough: someone was out there, and no one was coming. Humanity was young in galactic terms. Barely 2 centuries into deep space integration, their reach was small, their influence negligible. Most advanced species regarded them as chaotic but tolerable, a race of tinkerers, survivors, and opportunists. Yet their greatest flaw, as some called it, was their persistent refusal to let go of old instincts, empathy, curiosity, and an almost reckless defiance of abandonment. The ship's systems logged the signal as low priority, but the crew thought differently. They rerouted. Not for profit. Not for protocol. But because they could. And because someone had reached out. The decision wasn't noble. It was human. The asteroid was hostile, magnetic turbulence, no viable landing grid, and radiation pulses strong enough to blind sensors. But they found him. Vaeraxis didn't look like anything from human databases. No artist's rendering captured his scale or stillness. His breath came in slow, seismic exhales. His eyes, dim stars once bright enough to reflect nebulae, flickered like dying coals. He did not move when they arrived. Did not respond when hailed. He expected scavengers or executioners. Instead, he felt warmth, not in a physical sense, but in proximity. A kind he hadn't felt since his clutch mates vanished across a war front centuries ago. He prepared himself for the end. But the humans didn't leave. Their medbay wasn't built for beings of his size or biology. They had no reference points for Draconid anatomy. Yet they began. Scanners adjusted. Nanites reprogrammed. Environmental suits modified. One by one, crew members approached his inert body, marking injury sites, attempting to stabilize vitals they didn't fully understand. Failure followed failure, but they pressed on. They didn't know he could hear. Not in the usual way, but through resonances, vibrations carried through the asteroid's crust. Their voices, raw with uncertainty, carried no fear. Just concern. Curiosity. Urgency. They asked questions, told jokes, shared music through their comm systems, not knowing it translated into vibrations across the metal they installed beside him. Vaeraxis, in his fragmented consciousness, began to notice. Not what they were doing, but how. He felt their confusion, their makeshift improvisations, and most of all, their refusal to quit. They offered him no promises, demanded nothing in return, showed no fear of his form or his past. One engineer rested her gloved hand against his side while recalibrating field stabilizers, whispering encouragement to a being whose name had once inspired terror. There was no spectacle, no grand statement. Just presence. Unwavering and ordinary in its sincerity. Elsewhere, the Concorde watched with detached scrutiny. Their satellites flagged the anomaly. Internal memos circulated. But no action was taken, yet. To them, humans playing doctor with a dying dragon was as futile as patching a collapsing star. Let them try. Let them exhaust themselves. It would change nothing. But it did. Not in galactic headlines or strategic forecasts. In something quieter. Vairaxis, once the terror of solar tides, felt stillness give way to sensation. The hum of tools, the pressure of hands, the heartbeat-like thrum of engines pulsing beside him. And for the first time in centuries, he did not dream of ending. He listened. He did not speak. Not yet. But he remembered. The faces of his kind lost to ash. The betrayal of treaties written in starlight and shattered in silence. He remembered what it meant to be seen, not as a weapon, not as a relic, but as someone worth saving. And the humans, unaware of the weight they had shifted, simply worked on. The crew of the Argonaut's wake had no guidebook for what came next. They had answered a signal no one else dared to acknowledge and found something no one else would have believed, a dragon the size of a star freighter, breathing but broken, wrapped in cosmic scars and silence. The name Vairaxis hadn't appeared in any human files, yet the weight of his presence spoke for itself. Even diminished, his scale defied logic. His wings, torn and retracted, stretched like collapsed solar sails. His form was alien, yet unmistakably alive. The team moved fast, not out of panic but urgency. They couldn't leave him. Not after coming this far. Not when something so vast and wounded had called out, however faintly. Their medical systems strained against limits. The medpods were never designed for entities without blood or organs in the conventional sense. Vairaxis's body radiated electromagnetic surges that shorted sensors, and his surface temperature oscillated beyond safe thresholds. Every reading broke a rule. Every attempt at analysis returned impossibilities. Still, they worked. They built makeshift cooling grids from mining heat exchangers and retooled cargo cranes into skeletal braces. Engineers sketched new protocols on the fly. They siphoned hydrogen from the asteroid's crust and redirected it through ion channels to stabilize ambient temperature. A field biologist modified fungal growth inhibitors to treat the strange calcification overtaking Vairaxis's right flank. No one knew if any of it would help. But the dragon hadn't stopped breathing. Vairaxis had not spoken. Not with words. His language was constructed in solar pulses and harmonic frequencies. What the crew understood came not from translation but pattern. He hadn't moved, yet his awareness became undeniable. He shifted subtly, as if adjusting to their efforts. His massive eye, nearly shut, opened just enough to reflect one of the crew's helmets. A flicker of observation, not instinct. One of the technicians, Elon, left a small recorder near his head. It played fragments of Earth audio, human laughter, wind through trees, the rhythm of rain on glass. It wasn't scientific. It wasn't approved. But when the sounds echoed across the hull, Vairaxis's bioluminescence pulsed in soft patterns, barely perceptible. No verbal confirmation, but a reaction all the same. Their actions had consequences. The Concorde issued a direct communication: cease interference immediately or face diplomatic consequences. The message was dry, cold, and steeped in bureaucratic threat. The crew acknowledged it but didn't alter course. Orders didn't outweigh conscience. Their captain replied with a single sentence, asterisk. He's not dead yet. Asterisk. Within days, external monitoring probes from various Concorde-aligned factions began to orbit the asteroid. They didn't attack, only observed. Waiting, perhaps, for the humans to fail or for Vairaxis to expire. But failure didn't come. Nor did surrender. Repairs continued. Structural stabilizers were drilled into the rock face to secure Vairaxis's weight. Nutrient dispersal systems were jury-rigged using agricultural nanogel filtered through modified oxygen scrubbers. A mathematician with no medical experience devised a pulse rhythm to mimic the timing of draconid energy discharge. Everything was experimental, nothing guaranteed. Despite the odds, subtle change began. Vairaxis's wing membranes, once tattered like burned paper, began to reform, thin filaments reconnecting under patchwork treatment. The bioplasmic leaks slowed. The ambient energy field around his chest, previously erratic, grew stable enough to allow closer work. His breathing deepened. His massive frame, though still unmoving, no longer radiated collapse. Some crews slept beside the dragon, not out of necessity but conviction. A gesture of solidarity, of presence. They shared food beside his flank, played soft music, told stories they knew he couldn't understand. Still, something changed in the air around them. The crew began referring to him not as the subject but he. His name, once alien, became familiar. One night cycle, the lights aboard the ship flickered, not from system failure, but from something else. Vairaxis's throat, blackened and dormant, glowed faintly with pulsing light. No words. Just a low-frequency hum, as if testing ancient vocal pathways. The resonance traveled through metal and skin, shaking bones, vibrating nerves. It wasn't a threat. It was acknowledgement. From that moment, the crew worked not just with urgency but with belief. They weren't delaying the inevitable anymore. They were helping something survive that had no business still breathing. Not just a relic, not a weapon, something sentient. Something wronged. Across the galaxy, silence remained the official policy. Yet the event was no longer hidden. Footage leaked. Transmissions intercepted. Whispers spread in orbital markets and encrypted channels. The humans had found something the Concord tried to erase, and instead of running, they stayed. Vairaxis didn't speak in any known language. He didn't promise repayment, alliance, or favor. He did not offer trust. But as his strength returned in fractions, so did his awareness. What he had lost in centuries of betrayal was being returned, piece by improbable piece, by hands that expected nothing. And for the first time in an age, he waited, not to die, but to see what these strange, stubborn creatures would do next. News of the humans' actions traveled beyond surveillance logs. While the Concord kept official silence, factions within began to stir. The incident wasn't just a violation of regulation, it was a challenge to established power. Vairaxis wasn't merely a remnant of a bygone era. He represented everything the Concord had tried to erase. A species too proud to kneel, too powerful to cage. If the humans succeeded in reviving him, they would undo centuries of calculated extinction. Not through rebellion, but through defiance wrapped in compassion. The humans weren't aware of the magnitude of what they were unraveling. They just kept going. Their repairs grew more refined. Sensor readings normalized. Internal energy levels in Vairaxis, previously erratic and fading, began to stabilize. He wasn't healed, but he was no longer deteriorating. The crew's methods shifted from triage to restoration. Internal systems, organs of radiant fusion and magnetic resonance, were gradually reactivated. Entire sections of his frame, once inert, began responding to stimulation. They didn't know what they were waking. But they did it anyway. Vairaxis remained silent, but his reactions became precise. He adjusted posture subtly to accommodate equipment. He slowed his breathing when tools approached sensitive regions. He monitored crew movements without appearing to. These weren't instincts of an animal. They were the measured responses of intelligence. The crew understood this, even if they couldn't communicate with him directly. One breakthrough came when a young linguistics officer identified rhythmic pulses in the radiation Vairaxis emitted. These pulses weren't random. They matched harmonic intervals used in ancient quantum language theory. With improvised instruments, the crew created pulse-based responses. Slowly, a rudimentary form of communication emerged. Not language and words, but pattern recognition, call and response. Yes, no, help, pain, wait. It was limited, but mutual. The process deepened their bond. They began to ask questions, not about his past, but about his condition, his needs. Each answered signal created a new line of possibility. He guided them subtly toward the energy cores embedded in his chest, fractured structures pulsing erratically. Repairs began there. They required precision beyond standard tech. The crew relied on intuition, calculation, and instinct. What they lacked in data, they compensated for in persistence. As Veyaraxis stabilized, the tone of observation changed. Probes were no longer passive. A stealth drone from a Concord paramilitary arm attempted to scan the ship's internal logs and was destroyed by a low-intensity pulse from Veyaraxis, an automatic defense, not an attack. Still, it raised alarm. Concord strategists feared escalation. If Veyaraxis regained full capacity, he could pose a symbolic threat far greater than physical force. The humans, knowingly or not, were rewriting the narrative. What was buried as a mistake was returning as a survivor. The crew faced pressure. Threats came through encrypted channels. Warnings of blacklisting, court-martial, excommunication from interstellar coalitions. Still, they refused to abandon the mission. Their ship, never meant for war, became a line in the sand. They modified internal shielding, rerouted systems, established failsafes. They weren't preparing for battle. They were preparing to hold their ground. Inside the asteroid bay, the energy changed. Veyaraxis, once inert, began generating low-frequency fields. They didn't interfere with machinery, but they altered the emotional atmosphere. Crew reported calm under stress. Focus during exhaustion. This wasn't coincidence. It was intentional modulation. Veyaraxis, unable to speak, was speaking nonetheless. Not just gratitude, but understanding. He saw them now. Not as lesser beings, not as curiosities, but as allies. They didn't come with force. They didn't ask for power. They simply stayed. The repairs continued, now assisted by Veyaraxis himself. He directed minute changes in gravity fields to support engineering work. He stabilized magnetic pressure during core adjustments. The relationship shifted. No longer patient and caretaker, but collaborators. Each step forward was earned through trust forged under pressure. Veyaraxis's memory returned in fragments. The wars. The betrayals. The execution orders signed not by enemies, but former partners. He remembered planets scorched not by rage, but by fear of what he could become. Yet here he was, healed not by ancient allies, but by a species barely known. They had no reason to help, and yet they gave everything. Across the galactic net, pirate channels and forbidden boards buzzed with speculation. A dragon was breathing again, and humans were at the center of it. Not through conquest. Not through rebellion. Through care. It was a narrative the Concord couldn't counter without drawing attention. So, they watched, and planned. But Veyaraxis had felt something return he thought extinct, the will to live. And the humans, ignorant of political consequence, had reignited something the galaxy had buried, hope, not just for him, but for what else might be possible. The moment came quietly, no grand declaration, no seismic shift, just a steady hum beneath the deck plates and the slow, deliberate motion of something once thought immobile. Veyaraxis extended one claw, not in threat, but in balance, testing the restored strength of his limb. Systems around him calibrated automatically, gravity compensators adjusting as his mass shifted. For the crew, it was proof. Not hope. Not theory. Proof. The impossible was no longer hypothetical. Repairs had reached a turning point. Internal power matrices were rebalanced, energy flow redirected through conduits once clogged with inert crystallized plasma. A low, sustainable fusion state stabilized within Veyaraxis's core, allowing him to maintain minimal movement without draining the environment. The crew's methods had evolved beyond improvisation. They understood his rhythms now, his regenerative cycles, the demands of his unique physiology. They worked alongside him, not over him. Their bond was no longer incidental. It was mutual. The dragon who had once been seen as a force of destruction now lay at the center of a quiet alliance built on effort, not obligation. He began responding to requests with purposeful actions, extending wings to allow access to joint clusters, controlling internal temperature during nanosurgical repairs. What had begun as recovery became refinement. He was not just surviving. He was preparing. The Argonaut's wake adapted with him. Cargo bays were converted into shielded labs. Crew members shifted roles to meet the complexity of maintaining a living organism more massive than the ship itself. Every adjustment Veyraxis made forced the crew to recalibrate systems, but none of them complained. They had stopped counting hours. Purpose replaced routine. Meanwhile, outer space grew tense. The Concorde's surveillance turned overt. Larger ships lingered in orbit, cloaked but detectable. Communication silence was no longer passive, it was strategic. They waited, watching the progress unfold while political factions debated a response. Some feared open engagement. Others advocated preemptive containment. The consensus, fractured but loud, concluded one thing: the situation was no longer isolated. A legend was waking, and humans were the reason. Among other civilizations, the story evolved. Some saw in humanity a dangerous unpredictability, a reckless defiance of established order. Others whispered about them differently: the only species willing to care for something long deemed untouchable. The only ones who did not recoil at power, but extended a hand when everyone else turned away. Inside the asteroid, Veyraxis began to regain more than motion. His memory threads, previously dormant, synchronized. He remembered his kind, not as war machines or demigods, but as beings of vast perception and deep emotion. Their extinction hadn't been inevitable. It had been chosen, orchestrated through coordinated betrayal and calculated propaganda. He felt no vengeance stir in him now, only clarity. Those who destroyed his kin had not succeeded in erasing him. And those who saved him had no stake in his past. They didn't resurrect him for power. They knew nothing of his legacy. They simply acted from instinct. Trust deepened when a mechanical failure occurred. A venting line ruptured mid-procedure, threatening to destroy weeks of internal stabilization. Instead of retreating, a crew of engineers stood firm, risking their lives to seal the breach. Veyraxis saw this. He absorbed the risk they took, not calculated sacrifice, but willingness to stand beside him when safety vanished. It altered something in him. Shortly after, his pulse shifted. Not randomly, but with intent. A pattern emerged, slow, rhythmic, unmistakably structured. The linguistic officer cross-referenced it against earlier attempts and identified a message. Not a word but a symbol. A designation once encoded in Draconid interlink, honor returned. It wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. The humans responded not with fanfare but silence. They knew what it meant. In response, Veyraxis extended a new field, an electromagnetic sheath protecting the asteroid from further scans. Not aggressive. Defensive. He claimed space. Not with force, but with presence. A declaration without voice. He was no longer dying, and he was no longer alone. Inside the Concorde, panic simmered. Simulations revised threat assessments. Old protocols were reopened. Political actors demanded action. Yet none could agree on how to proceed without revealing their role in what had once been hidden history. Silence had been their shield. Now it was a liability. And still, the humans worked. Not for reward. Not to weaponize. Simply to finish what they started. Because they refused to abandon what others discarded. Veyraxis, bound no longer by weakness, knew what he must do. Not revenge. Not retribution. Something greater. Something that began not in fire, but in the simple, human act of staying when no one else would. The final stage began without warning. Veyraxis activated systems long thought extinct, neural conduits beneath his scales, vast arrays of memory filaments curled around fusion anchors deep in his chest. His form, once barely breathing, surged with internal cohesion. The restoration wasn't just physical. It was identity reclaiming its shape. A mind of incomprehensible age reawakening not through anger, but clarity. The human stood witness not to a return of a legend, but to the becoming of one in real time. He rose fully, not towering in dominance but standing in sovereignty. Space warped gently around him, not in distortion, but recognition. Gravity bowed. The humans stepped back, not in fear, but in awe. No words passed between them. None were needed. He had received care without terms. Restoration without obligation. And now, he chose his next act not out of vengeance, but intent sharpened by long reflection and the undeniable fact that someone, finally, had seen him not as myth or threat, but being. The Concorde's silence shattered. An envoy vessel appeared without preamble, its sleek hull radiating formal authority. Diplomats armed with protocols, prepared to negotiate terms of surrender or withdrawal. But they found themselves faced with something that would not fit their categories. The dragon said nothing. He didn't need to. The humans stood unarmed. The Concorde delegation, fully armed with documentation, authority, and pressure, found none of it relevant. There was no force to disarm, no war to defuse. Just the quiet presence of something older than their civilization and the crew that refused to abandon him. Surveillance probes lost signal near the asteroid. Not from interference, but because Vairaxis absorbed their transmissions, an old defense now sharpened into elegant utility. Without firing a shot, he rendered the entire Concorde fleet blind within proximity. Not an attack, but an assertion. He controlled his space. The humans said nothing. They stood on the same deck where they once patched ruptured conduits with spare wiring and manual sealant, watching as history shifted beneath their feet. Across fringe networks, the event exploded. Unaffiliated races watched in disbelief as the Concorde, long untouchable, was forced into passive presence. Not a war, but an unraveling. The narrative couldn't be controlled. A species discarded as primitive had restored something the most advanced civilizations chose to erase. No propaganda could spin the truth. Humans saved a being too powerful to understand, not for profit or gain, but because they could not walk away. Vairaxis reached out, not physically, but through electromagnetic resonance. His pulses transmitted across unfiltered channels. Not threats. Not demands. A history previously redacted, now exposed. He released images, memories, records from his species' final days. Not as condemnation, but evidence. The Concorde's betrayal wasn't hearsay anymore. It was documentation, encoded within him, now broadcast to anyone willing to receive it. Systems that once obeyed political firewalls now hummed with foreign data. The truth couldn't be erased again. World stirred. Some called it destabilization. Others called it justice. No matter the perspective, the core truth was singular. Something ancient had returned, and it had been humans who brought it back. Entire star councils opened emergency sessions. Alliances began to shift under the weight of uncertainty. For the first time in generations, power structures realized they were vulnerable not to war, but to legacy. But the humans didn't seek revolution. Their mission had ended the moment Vairaxis could breathe unaided. Their work, in their minds, was done. They requested no compensation. Filed no claims. They didn't stay to demand alliance or favor. They simply prepared to leave, tools packed, systems cleaned, ship reset for travel. They had restored what was right to restore. The rest wasn't theirs to control. Vairaxis didn't stop them. He could have. A being of his scale could have offered unimaginable gifts or positioned himself as protector or benefactor. But he didn't. Instead, he sent a single pulse, a precise sequence, now understood as a name only his kind had used for those they held highest. Not followers. Not servants. Equals in purpose. The transmission lasted seconds. It was recorded, encrypted, stored by every human aboard. None of them spoke it aloud. They knew what it meant. The Argonaut's wake departed under its own power. As it left the asteroid field, distant ships peeled away, unsure whether to pursue or withdraw. No directives were issued. No retaliation followed. The Concorde, for all its posturing, had no precedent for a response. Diplomacy collapsed under its own irrelevance. In time, Vairaxis vanished from visible scans. Not destroyed, not hidden, moving on his own terms. His path unknown, but his presence undeniable. Rumors whispered of strange sightings across remote systems, of a silent guardian watching unknown worlds. No confirmation. Only echoes. And in archives, museums, and forbidden corners of alien databases, one fact remained: the humans had done what no other had dared. They stayed. They healed. They walked away. And the galaxy would never be able to forget them again.